This is the Fresh Start Project, where we explore the growing loss of trust in social institutions and how we can break free from broken systems and move forward towards something better. I'm Christian Mislowick, and with me today is Samo Burja. Samo is the founder and president of Bismarck Analysis, a San Francisco-based consulting firm. He writes and speaks on history, institutions, and strategy with a focus on exceptional leaders that create new social and political forms. He has developed the Great Founder Theory, which describes how leaders create the institutions that shape society. Samo, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on the show, Christian.
Absolutely. So before we even get started, I wanted to mention one thing. I saw on Twitter that you recently visited Dubrovnik, Croatia. Is that right?
Yes, I was there for an extended weekend.
Dubrovnik is so high on my to-visit list. It's just so beautiful. It's like it's got that Venetian architecture, but on the entirely other side of the Adriatic. It's so interesting.
So many of the Adriatic cities have that, imprint of Venice. And Dubrovnik was also a merchant city in its own right and had some history as an independent city-state.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how the heavily islanded nature of Dalmatia lent itself naturally to sort of sea-based power and also to political autonomy of cities.
Yeah, I love it. Really cool. So again, thanks for joining me. And to start, I want to begin with this sociological framework that you developed called the Great Founder Theory. I've been reading some of your documents, and it seems to me that this framework comes down to answering this question: what drives social change throughout history and the present? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this Great Founder Theory really answers that question. Is that about right?
It certainly attempts to answer it, right? As is the case with theories of history, there's a multiplicity of them. They can be difficult to evaluate. And unlike, some, let's say, more hard sciences, right? When it comes to the soft sciences, it can be difficult to sort of tease out what is the very best explanation or theory. So Great Founder Theory is, for now, and has been for many years, my sort of best attempt to come at that question. I don't deny the influence of structural forces, right? Things like, the long-term effects of laws, of religion, of culture, of technology, even of the accumulation of material wealth. But what I do ask is, do these trends sometimes get reshaped profoundly? And also, where do these laws, religions, cultures, technologies ultimately come from? And the very simple version of the answer and the argument that I make in my work is that I think exceptional individuals are often at the heart of the formation of new institutions. So the distinction between this and, say, a more classic great man theory of history is that a great general, while of course important for pivotal battles, is not someone I would automatically consider a great founder, right? A great founder would be a general that deeply reformed their country's military in a way that ended up affecting its performance for decades and centuries. I think some of these institutions, be it the military, be it political, be it economic, religious, they really profoundly reshape entire societies. They define civilizations on their own terms. And if we can trace these down to the efforts of particular exceptional individuals, then really they're kind of the fulcrum of history.
And so you would argue that it's not necessarily an individual who is shaping society. They have to establish some sort of human activity, some sort of long-lived organization. Is that about right?
Or a profound cultural and other legacy, right? Like cultural, political, social legacy. Say, I would consider in the Chinese context Confucius to be a great founder, even though he basically started a philosophical and sort of government reform school, if we're sort of being generous to what he began, like a way or a school of thought. In the Western context, a much more classical figure might be Charlemagne, who I think really forged kind of a consensus, or not a consensus, a mode of government and society that lasted for 800 years and kind of defined Western civilization as we now think of it. What would be Western civilization without Charlemagne's Frankish Empire, right? Like feudalism, the revival of the use of Latin in an administrative and scholastic context, the clear break with the Mediterranean world, the sort of fusion of Northern and Southern Europe. We could just keep on listing more and more features that we associate with medieval Europe and then early modern Europe that have their start in Charlemagne's Frankish Empire.
So in your great founder theory, there's an entire vocabulary and list of terminology, and institution that has a reoccurring role in your theory. So how would you define an institution, and how would you differentiate between a functioning institution and a non-functioning institution?
We can think of institutions as these sort of automated zones of human coordination. It's like the individuals participate and replicate a certain pattern of human behavior in them. What might this mean? This means that when you go join the army, the boot camp sort of indoctrinates you, remolds you, trains you up, either makes you a part of the military or excludes you, throws you away. The process of the reproduction of the institution has happened. You will behave like a good soldier or a good officer, right? And then similar mechanisms can be pointed out for other organizations, right, such as the Catholic Church and so on and so on. They sustain a particular pattern of functioning, of organization, and the individuals, to some extent, become substitutable. Like it's not always the case that an individual can be replaced, but for most of these institutions, they do transcend the typical individual. There's a bit of a paradox because they themselves are, in my theory, the result of exceptional individuals. So then always the question is, can someone capable of founding a new organization really succeed in the old one? Or must they always strike anew and sort of bypass the clogged, bureaucratic, and sclerotic nature that inevitably arises? A functional institution would be an institution fit for purpose, for a particular purpose. It does what it says on the tin. It is an army that is victorious. It is a university system that promotes the creation of new knowledge and the dissemination of new knowledge. It's an economic custodian that encourages growth. It's a political system that pursues sort of the well-being of the polity. And then if I go through this list, like already just listing these examples, it perhaps becomes obvious that many institutions are not functional. Many things do not do what they say on the tin, right? We have armies that can't win wars, universities that do not encourage intellectual excellence. Do I even need to talk about economic administration and the current Western world? I don't think I really need to talk about that at all. It speaks for itself. And then for the politics as well, they've certainly lost the vision and drive that resulted in sort of the power of the Western world. Now, I don't just focus on the Western world. Like I've read about Ottoman Turkey and the Chinese civilization, and I've written articles on it. I think for better or worse, we have to understand that civilization on its own terms, which shockingly few people are doing, despite the fact that it's going to be important for the rest of our life.
Right. Now, when you mention automatized or
Ottoman Empire, sorry.
Oh, right.
You meant automated institution, automated zone of coordination. Yeah.
Right, automated. So that kind of brings to mind somebody at an assembly line, like just pulling a lever, or maybe a bureaucrat rubber stamping papers. Does that just mean somebody's they're following a established procedure as opposed to constantly innovating on the fly? Like what do you mean by automated?
Well, it is a pattern that repeats, and a pattern that is repeated without the necessity of everyone involved in the pattern understanding what it is they're recreating. It does not have to be centralized and bureaucratized. That is one way to implement it. An alternative method, something to consider, is that codes of law, such as common law
Mhm.
in its origins, or perhaps Icelandic pagan law in the 11th century, 12th, 13th century.
Mhm.
These are systems where there is a pretty clear code. It's not really changeable. There is some decision-making leeway, but the process through which something is a legitimate ruling or an illegitimate ruling, the process through which law is applied is pretty automated and kind of runs on its own. It doesn't need the act of reinvention. It might need active reinvention if the code of law no longer fits the social or economic circumstances of a society, right? But as long as it does, it's functional and there's this distributed way in which it reproduces itself.
Mhm.
But yeah, totally, it could be a bureaucratic structure too. Like if we look at the institution of scribes, or even more so, the high priests of ancient Egypt, that's clearly a pretty centralized, often very bureaucratic, very hierarchical system where it almost doesn't matter what a particular high priest decides to do. They're basically just following in the tracks of the interest of their particular temple, the traditions of their particular temple, and they have to stick to ritual, partially as a measure of their own legitimacy.
Mhm. So there's a code that they're operating within, and everybody kind of agrees on the code.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Like even say the common peasants of ancient Egypt certainly won't know the intricacies of what's written in the hieroglyphic texts that the high priest is supposed to study, but they're going to figure out if the yearly sacrifice or ritual looks fishy or looks
Uh-huh.
new or looks different. They're going to remember that. It's good to remember that in the history of religion, you've had entire peasant rebellions happen because of a change in liturgy. Why? Because while theology is inaccessible to the masses, the orthopraxy, right, that is accessible to everyone, right?
Mhm.
Everyone in, say, Eastern Europe, in Russia, right? Everyone knew how you're supposed to pray as a good Orthodox Christian. So it was extremely controversial when reforms came top down to change the manner of prayer and so on. It created a schism within the Russian Orthodox Church, where a group called the Old Believers, that are around to this day, sort of broke off because they didn't want these changed rituals. The reason the rituals changed, ironically, was because they had sent people to go check on how the Greeks were doing orthodoxy. And the
Mm.
Greeks were doing orthodoxy differently. And the assumption in Russia was that, oh, wow, well, they must be doing the real thing, right? So even the reform, the top-down reform, was justified in terms of a return to the old because the old was assumed to be more legitimate.
Right. Interesting. That's so funny. Those the Greeks are always coming up with innovations in Christianity. I mean, introducing the vernacular liturgy, and I think it was the slow. I think it was Moravian Empire at the time, but part of Bohemia, and then in
Mhm.
Bohemia, like some centuries later, the idea of that the congregation could receive the Eucharist in the form of the wine as opposed to just the bread, the host. That created the Hussite War, and so just a little what we would probably describe as minutiae in religious history. People die all the time from those types of things.
Well, sometimes this is because the actual fight is over something else, and that's a legitimizing event. But other times, very small changes to social technology. What do I mean by social technology, right? Is a complement to material technology. It's codes of law, rituals, culture, the way we raise children, the way we select who has power. All of these things, very small changes can result in profound incompatibilities,
Mhm.
right? It might not seem like a big deal to say change inheritance laws slightly, but we can even point at whole regions of the planet where small differences in inheritance result in a vastly different distribution of wealth and a vastly different pattern of development. And then small differences in how you do something like a Eucharist in the 16th century matter profoundly. Like they matter profoundly for just the regulation of the emotional life of a whole community,
Mhm.
right? And again, one way to think about it, and we tend to forget this, theater today is secular. But in ancient Greece, theater was not secular. It was a religious activity.
Oh, really?
And it was one, yes, that was participated by the entire citizenry of a polis, a city-state. Today, if you go to many of the remnants of these classical and even pre-classical cities, you'll see these massive theaters that could seat tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
And as far as we know, these cities were tiny. They only had a few tens of thousands of people. So there were certain, like Eleusinian mysteries or whatever, certain rituals the whole town was supposed to go through. And then this concept that during a play you experience catharsis and all of this, these were means of regulating the emotional life of communities. Today, we don't think of that as profoundly important for political stability, but I think that's to our own detriment. And I think it is not an accident that in an age where we consider the regulation of one's emotional life an individual problem is also the age of therapy, which could be argued to be secularized confession, and also the age of massive substance abuse.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I don't think there's a modern equivalent to a sort of group religious theater today.
That everyone in the city would participate in, right?
Right.
Like it's much more fragmented, right? Maybe people still have alive, living religious communities, but it's not like a whole city event.
No. I mean, maybe some church in Catholicism, you could walk the Stations of the Cross around Easter, or
Right.
doing the Hajj in Islam. But I think you're right. Maybe when there isn't that emotional regulatory group tradition, that doesn't mean that the human desire or the need for that outlet disappears. I think Jordan Peterson always talks about how rock concerts kind of play some sort of role equivalent to a pagan worship session. It's emotional. It touches the spirit.
Well, other observers have noted that sports fandoms bear a surprising similarity to gladiatorial games. Perhaps no one is getting killed, though they might be getting concussions, but often it does bring a whole city together. And with a symbolic combat with a different city.
Right. So in classical Rome, when they had gladiatorial games, they did not have those group religious theater events, right?
They started as religious events, but over time they became less so.
Okay.
From what I understand, the gladiatorial combat started actually as a kind of almost human sacrifice, where at the funeral of a notable person, two people fought. And, this reminds me of the fact that, in the Bronze Age and earlier, sometimes in some cultures, but not all, important people would have their servants buried with them when they died. So, so the servants can follow them into the afterlife.
Right.
So there is a religious origin to it, but over time, it sort of becomes more and more of what we would think of as a sport. And say chariot racing played also a similar role in ancient Rome, where fans divided first into 4 teams that eventually consolidated into 2 teams, the blues and the greens. And people would, be very proud of them being blues or greens, to the point where these became almost political parties. So like by the time of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, sometimes the blues or the greens would support different factions as to who should be emperor. And they have opinions on various heresies for or against Arianism, for or against iconoclasticism, etc.
Based on the sports team you
Based
follow.
on your sports team. I mean, of course, your sports team has opinions about religion and politics, right?
Sure.
I mean, it sounds funny to us, but also very understandable. Right. And there was always this connection because, one way to think about it is today in Europe, right, over the past few decades, there are times when, say, football hooligans were politically relevant, right? Anyone who can, in an urban context, bring a mob of people to do organized violence, if it's just to beat up the other team's fans, okay. But that is also useful to organized crime. It is useful to paramilitary action as well. When they came to the totalitarian movements of the early 20th century, a lot of them escaped being classed as illegal because they were sports groups. So, a sports group could strengthen themselves and could basically practice as a militia
Right.
and be deployed as kind of a paramilitary unit, protests at coups, at revolutions, and all of that.
Wow. That is certainly something to think about. It's so funny that so many of those early forms of entertainment or the arts like theater, the gladiatorial combat, the race, chariot races, they're degraded religious ceremonies. And
Yes.
yeah. And then,
Sometimes scaled up, sometimes repurposed for political use, right? Because of course, politics, not just religion for a more spiritual perspective, but politics for a very temporal one, has an interest in regulating human emotional life.
so would you say a great founder is somebody who um, they can recognize when an innovation is needed, but they know exactly how to integrate it into the community without the community turning on them, or just knowing when too much is not too soon?
Well, unless they can institute, a person might have a profound insight into the human condition. They might have a profound insight into the strengths or the weaknesses of their own society and how best to build upon those and or correct for them. But really, unless they can instantiate their thinking on society, even if only through teaching sort of the next generation of reformers, if they can't do that, then they can't be a great founder. The great founder does not necessarily reshape all of society immediately, but they do lay the foundations for something that reshapes all of society in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Like they're writing the program that others can follow and operationalize.
Right, right. Like in the case of Confucius, he never achieved any success in Chinese reform. It
Mm-hmm.
was his students and the students of his students that ended up profoundly reshaping Chinese civilization, right? To the point where China keeps returning to Confucianism centuries, sometimes after several centuries, experimenting with something else. Many people today don't know that, for example, in the 7th century AD, China was a profoundly Buddhist country where Buddhism enjoyed something like the state of official, position as an official religion.
Mm.
But by the 11th and 12th century, this status had once again waned, and Taoism, Chinese folk religion, and sometimes even things like Nestorian Christianity returned, but the civil service sort of followed again, basically Confucian philosophy, right? And the power of the monasteries was broken,
Mm.
which is its own. It's so interesting, isn't it, that Europe and Asia have these strange parallels in history. Like
Yeah.
if you consider it, Japanese feudalism, of course, profoundly different than Western European feudalism, but still there are deep parallels between the two. And say things like, the power of monasteries or the conflict between the monasteries and the monarch. These are things that play out across these different societies and civilizations and all these time periods over and over again.
Right. And in great founder theory, in your theory, I think you've written in kind of your thesis, the book you wrote, that what a civilization is a meshwork of institutions, functioning and non-functioning, that are working together in an ecosystem. Is that about right?
Yes, an interdependent ecosystem of institutions. What is implied by this? What is implied is that there are different civilizations that are possible. There are different equilibria that are possible. Not all institutions are mutually compatible,
Mm-hmm.
or at least not perfectly so. What's also implied is that there are a few key institutions that just radically outperform all the other ones. We talked earlier about functional institutions, right? It seems to me that no matter what type of organization you look at, the truly innovative or exemplars of that class, right, of that set, are going to radically outperform their peers, right? You're going to have companies that are worth 10 times as much as their competitors. You're going to have armies that are, beat enemies at like 5-to-1 ratios. You're going to have religions that have hundreds of millions of people versus cults that fizzle out with a few hundred followers.
Yeah.
Really distinct outcomes for things that nominally on paper are pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because often I think you have sort of these originals that are breakthroughs, and then you have bad copies, like photocopies, right?
Yeah.
So you can have a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy that's very degraded. It's still like if you list out on paper what it has, it like looks like a great institution. In practice, it just doesn't fit together in the details because the people who are trying to build it are following a stereotype. They're following a recipe, a cookbook, and over time, that cookbook necessarily degrades, mistakes creep in, but also circumstances change. Things might become obsolete.
Mm.
And if I can liken a civilization to a forest, a forest doesn't die with the death of a particular tree, no matter how ancient. But a forest does die, or could be said to die, once after the old trees die, new ones don't grow. So when it comes to civilizations, they seem to have a lifespan where some of these mutually interdependent institutions phase out. They can be replaced by others. But there come times where the breakdown of too many of them at the same time results in something like a cultural or social technology reset. Sometimes this is combined with something like a material reset or even a population crash. Like in Eurasian history, the New World is a bit different. The Americas are a bit different. But in Eurasian history, there are like 12 identifiable dark ages, right? Times when it's very clear that the population went down, the technology regressed, that a particular society wasn't just transformed for the better, but actually notably became worse in very tangible ways. The usual examples people give of this is sort of the fall of the Roman Empire, but we could list things like the late Bronze Age collapse around 1000 BC, where, say, literacy was lost in what would later become Greece, right? That's the boundary between, say, the Mycenaeans and the classical Greeks. Or, say, the collapse of Indian civilization with cities like Mohenjo-daro also vanishing many, many thousands of years ago.
So what's going on in those civilizations that leads to a collapse? Are there any commonalities?
Well, the theory of why civilizations fail, right? This has been, again, also very theorized on, because unless you sort of have an excessively optimistic read of human history, it does seem, regardless of what you think about as progress, that there are significant steps back. And occasionally, every now and then, people try to strenuously argue that, the Dark Ages weren't that dark. And that's kind of true, but still, the classical world did vanish, and much was lost when it vanished.
Right.
So even if the later periods of the Middle Ages are not as dark as once defamed, the early Middle Ages, in fact, see a massive drop in population, dropping living standards. But it is true that some of that happens in the very late stages of the Roman Empire as well. So the decline doesn't start when barbarians burn down the cities. It's the social transformation that leads to a situation where the barbarians can burn down the cities. Very much excessive extraction by the ruling class to sustain itself at the expense of long-term fundamentals. So excessive material extraction of an existing base. In the case of the Roman Empire, they couldn't conquer any new wealthy lands. So they, over time, more and more turned towards taxing what they already had and exhausting it, not just financially, but demographically even, having to eventually rely on mercenaries rather than their own citizens to support the military and security needs of the Roman Empire. So that's one, excessive extraction of elites. Why does this happen? It happens basically because in a way, all empires are Ponzi schemes. They work great until they stop growing. Once they stop growing, they hit severe problems of political economy. Basically, the coordination of elites is often sort of predicated on there being positive sum games, right? Like, Pompey and Caesar, to use a Roman example, can work together quite effectively while there's enough glory and power to go around. But once there's less power to go around, once it's become very concentrated, once they've sort of defeated all their political foes, the triumvirate breaks up, especially after the death of Crassus. So you can have a situation where the elites turn to excessive extraction and inter-elite conflict comes to dominate a society. And if we look at this at a societal level, not at the elite level, it very much looks like a society that has started digesting itself. And this can be a slow process. Like the correct way to think of the last century or two of, say, the Roman Empire isn't that there is a sudden crash and everything goes bad, but imagine GDP shrinks by 1% every year for 100 years. What you have at the end of that century, that sort of slow decay of wealth and so on, is profoundly different than what you had at the start. Even if any single year, the changes are so small as to be imperceptible. So it's a descent down a gradient. And then this thinning of societal reserves leaves you open to external shocks. And then when an external shock hits, your society, instead of responding back with vitality, collapses, crumbles on the spot. I think something very clearly similar is happening with the late Bronze Age collapse. I think it happened with the end of the Han Dynasty and in ancient China. And I think it's a sort of almost a universal pattern, right?
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier this idea of copycat institutions. Like there's a very functional and visionary institution. Let's say, there's like a Steve Jobs type person who institutes what we know as Apple in its heyday. And then there are the kind of the copies of copies. They can imitate, but it's an imperfect imitation because they don't understand the underlying principles. Like Steve Jobs, he wasn't just an engineer, he was also very artistically minded. He was influenced by aesthetic principles, and so that was part of the secret sauce of Apple. So it's this idea that the practices, they're only partially apprehended. There's the practitioners don't fully understand what they're doing. And I think you even said that founders create long-lasting institutions depending on how well they can teach others their vision. So it's almost like how well you can pass on knowledge is an important part of an institution or even a civilization's health. Does that sound about right to you?
The succession problem is a very fundamental problem.
Every
organization, the succession problem that every organization faces, right? It's we can think of it as power succession and knowledge succession, right? First off, does your successor know everything that they need to know? Often this is very very tacit knowledge. It's very dispersed stuff. It's not something that's easy to write into a document. It's not something that is easy to enumerate. But still, there's also the question of power succession where, the founder of a company, to use the company example, cannot help but have more power than the CEO that succeeds the founder of a company. Because they understand the thing inside out. They have many personal relationships with key personnel that whoever the CEO that replaces does not have. They also understand how, they understand how to use the levers of the thing. They built it after all. They understand them inside out. Meanwhile, often one of the first things an external CEO does coming into an idiosyncratic company is to make it more like all the other companies. In fact, arguably, the graduates of Harvard Business School specialize in making all companies the same. And then the question is, are these just because that's the correct way you should always run a company? Or is that because that's the way a Harvard MBA knows how to run a company?
Yeah.
Companies can be ruined by this. I'm going to be pretty straightforward. I'm not just going to leave that an implication. When the Harvard MBAs got started, let's say 80 years ago, right, where the whole MBA program came to be, I actually think it was immensely economically productive. But at this point, I'm wondering whether that's not itself a decayed institution, a non-functional institution. And at this point, engage more in economic extraction, right? Because, if you make a company easier to run by a Harvard guy, then it's going to be run by a Harvard guy forevermore. That's good for your network, right? That's good for your network, possibly good for your career, even if it's not that good for a company. But to go back to the power succession topic, right? The power succession question is interesting because so many people experience in the later, more bureaucratized stages of an organization how difficult it is to fix something that's broken. There's no better moment than the founding of an organization or a company to fix something that's broken. Every point later in its history, it's going to be more difficult. There will always be vested interests, right?
Yeah.
Before you create a structure, there's no vested interest. As soon as you create a structure, there's a vested interest that will automatically fight you. So, that's why, there's an element perhaps of luck in founding companies and other organizations, but I think there's also this sort of flash of brilliance where spark of brilliance, where everything just works. It just works too well. It just works from day one.
Let's talk about technical succession. I think I've read one of your articles. It was really fascinating. It's about how there was a moment in recent modern US history in which they were trying to recreate like a nuclear missile technology that they no longer knew how to create a component or a material needed to make it. And so they had
the code name for the materials, I think, Fogbank.
Could you tell that story? It's really interesting.
Well, there's not that much even to say beyond what you've said because so much of it is classified. But there was actually a significant research project, I think, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, to recreate this material, codenamed Fogbank. And they needed many, many years to do it because it's been so long since it was last done. A different example might be if we try to build the Saturn V rockets today, right? The exact same copy of the stuff that flew man to the moon in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
We would have the blueprints, probably. Though for a while, NASA noted they lost the blueprints. Apparently, then they recovered them.
Oh, wow.
But even if you recover and use the blueprints, all of the contractors are long gone or have gone into a different business.
Right.
You would have to rediscover what the quality of the components is, what the quality of the materials is. You would have to find all of these many subcomponents. In other words, you would have to recreate a whole business ecosystem around building Saturn V rockets. When it comes to technology, I think people underestimate the difficulty of just implementation, where they sort of, invention is a very important step in the emergence of a new technology. But I think two other steps. One is adoption. So when the technology is not just a curiosity, but finds a useful socioeconomic niche, and maintenance, where the technical preconditions for keeping everything working at a reasonable price. These two steps of adoption and maintenance, these are often neglected. We talk about inventors, great inventors, but not necessarily great maintainers. And today, one of the bigger problems with, say, nuclear power plants is they can be hard to find enough people trained how to run them.
Yeah.
The people that are trained to run them well are retiring. It's not been a growth industry for a very long time, and people got the memo and they didn't study nuclear engineering.
Yeah, that's a little terrifying. It's so funny that we can build a highly complex society and then run out of people who know how to keep it running. And then what's
Right.
left is just the inhabitants of uh, rubble that they don't understand or can't even comprehend. They can't repair. They would need to spend enormous amount of resources to back engineer. And then, like you said, they might have the problem of needing to create an entire ecosystem of business just to create the right parts. It really makes you appreciate how much knowledge is necessary and how dispersed it needs to be. It needs to be stored in many, many different brains and not just written down somewhere or even left on a hard drive.
Yeah, knowledge ultimately, at least for now,
Yeah,
resides in human minds.
right.
If it's in a book and no one reads it, fun fact, we don't know it. We
Yeah,
don't know what that book says.
that's interesting. So that brings me to another question that I would be interested in your answer. What is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And what role does wisdom play in a functioning civilization?
Well, this feels almost an unfair question, feels one of those that philosophers have argued over for a very long time.
Yeah.
But for my own inadequate answer, I would say a lot of wisdom is about a deep understanding of your own nature and your own motives and that
Mhm.
of others. Wisdom is a kind of knowledge about human nature, which means being honest to yourself about what it is you're trying to do. A lot of foolishness can be very intelligent, very high IQ, very technically sophisticated,
Yeah.
where people are doing at the end of the day something they perhaps don't even want to do, right? Or something they shouldn't do, and that they're hiding from themselves that they shouldn't do.
Right.
Or something that, while it is good in itself, when used by others, results in what the person would never have pursued, right? So you could maybe argue that the nuclear physicists building the atom bomb on the assumption that they're going to have a word in how it's used after they've done developing it. I think you
Mhm.
could say that they were foolish and that they weren't wise to the reality of the situation.
Sure.
Perhaps they were more focused on beating an enemy, but then they should have been wise enough to know that their own government has no reason to give them accurate updates as to how well the enemy is building the nuclear weapon or not,
Mhm.
right? And in fact, the Germans were way behind on in World War II on the development of a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I feel I feel wisdom then has to be something like the understanding, the understanding of human nature. Let's say,
Yeah. That's good.
yeah.
So obviously this great founder theory, you've spent an enormous amount of time, a great deal of time and research and thought describing how civilizations work and how institutions can either uh, have longevity or not, or change societies in a significant way. But then we can now kind of apply this theory, and I think we would want to apply the findings towards good, towards a functioning society. So what is the best thing that people can do in your point of view? Like, is it to build a long lasting civilization? Is it to serve democracy, or is it to serve security or the autonomy of the individual or the stability of the state? I mean, there's so many values we can pursue, but what ought someone do?
Well, to all your examples, I can say yes.
Okay.
Um, I think different parts of society is complex, right? That's why I use sort of the metaphor of a forest
Yeah.
with many trees in it, or many interdependent institutions. Um, I think inevitably different parts of society pursue a slightly different value system, have slightly different needs and peculiarities, right? You can't really have the same culture pervade an effective military and be applied inside of a for-profit company and be applied inside of a monastic order,
Sure.
right? Just because of their role, because of their profession and their space in society, there are going to be differences. And I think society works extremely well when the different elements of society are in symbiosis or in harmony. So if there was a meta lesson, it's sort of try to find, find your role in society, excel at it, and encourage the symbiosis of it with other parts, right?
Do you have any?
That's pretty abstract, but it can be concretized for every individual. In a way, you don't have to refound the institutions in your society. That's often very difficult.
Right.
You can just do the best that you possibly can. You can go out of your way also to find functional institutions. So if you're working at a fairly disappointing company, and there's an excellent company, something that's really innovative, something you want to be a part of, consider go working for that company, even if you expect your hours to be longer, right? Or if you see an exceptional individual, consider helping that individual or making yourself of use to them. Or if you feel that while you're on a pretty good track in terms of resources and prestige, there's actually a much less interesting university that's doing better work, consider going there. There are times, and those are great times, when the best thing you can do for society and the conventional choice and what's best for you, these three things are the same thing, but often they actually differ in important ways. And I would really emphasize sort of, especially if you suspect your corner of society is not functional, that it's dysfunctional, I would consider the contrarian bets, right? They can be to the individual's benefit too, or they can be wildly pro-social, but I encourage taking those. I encourage rewarding functional institutions with your effort. Don't chase after the failed things. Pursue what seems to be on a durable long-term course, right? So also don't pursue things that are sort of a flash in the pan. They're just the cool thing everyone else is doing.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about what an ideal form of government is?
Well, that which governs best is, I think, the classical quip. I actually think a wider variety of governments than what we would today consider ideal can be functional. I think you can have well-working republics, functioning republics. You can have functioning monarchies. And depending on where your society is, what its human capital is, what its stage of development is, what its political and social problems are, trying to create a republic could be a fool's errand that results in a totalitarian dystopia. I mean, I can give the example of, the Bolshevik Revolution as something that clearly was a utopian attempt to bring about a republic of equal individuals, but resulted almost in its opposite. Trying to instate a monarchy when you're not successful might result in a terrible dictatorship instead of sort of a firm, benevolent, reformist government, right? Especially one with long-term legitimacy, because an important difference between sort of a monarch and a dictator is that the dictator kind of doesn't care about what happens after their death. And ideally the monarch does.
Right. Yeah, concern for the posterity, it seems to be a really fundamental ethic.
Well, posterity, but also, often a lot of monarchs in classical Europe just believe that, yes, they are accountable to a higher power. Today, we're so cynical, we just assume that, them believing that they are accountable to God doesn't have much effect on their actions. But we know just from historical literature, a lot of these individuals are deeply pious. I think it did affect their political actions.
Right. So I'm really interested in comparing your framework to other theories of civilizations and civilizational collapse. First of all, are you familiar with J.D. Unwin?
No.
He was an English social anthropologist. This is all from Wikipedia. He was an anthropologist at Oxford and Cambridge. In 1931, he published Sex and Culture, in which he studied 80 primitive tribes and 6 large-scale civilizations across 5,000 years of history. And he came to this conclusion. He said that there's a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and sexual restraint. Cultures that practice a higher degree of sexual restraint before and after marriage outperform their contemporaries in all areas, including literature, art, science, architecture, engineering, agriculture. Conversely, increased sexual freedom always led to the collapse of a culture within 3 generations. And it looks like Unwin himself, he was not necessarily religious. He thought that this was an empirical inquiry when he wrote his book. Aldous Huxley praised the book. He said it was a really important work. So what do you think? Do you think there's a relationship between sexual restraint and sexual morality and cultural achievement?
It's a complex question.
Yeah.
And it's a complex question because I could propose counterexamples of periods that seem to be a cultural renaissance, perhaps literally, including the Italian Renaissance, where we could find many examples of, just what we would consider probably like immoral sexual behavior, right? Renaissance Italy, again, a good example, produces great statues, great art, but the papacy of that period is somewhat corrupt. The nobility is not really, known for its virtue and so on. I think that strong families are often just the bedrock of the creation of social capital. And yes, usually that requires some pretty rigorous social controls of sexuality, but that can look very different, right? Medieval Ottoman world is very different in its sexual rules, similar also, but different than medieval Europe. And today, of course, we might say that, but the monogamous societies outcompeted the polygamous societies. However, if you're in 16th century Europe, the battle doesn't look so decided, especially if you're in Vienna, right?
Yeah.
Like it might seem it's up in the air, and had the polygamous civilization won that battle, then maybe today we would be talking about the natural benefits of polygamy and so on, or if the Mormons successfully overthrew the U.S. federal government in some alternate history. I mean, the old school ones, not current ones are monogamous.
Right.
So that's an example, or the topic of divorce, right? You could have societies that allowed divorce, societies that didn't. And why does family structure? I think family structure is tied very closely to questions of property. And we, of course, know that, common property is just a thing that is very natural to almost all family units. And because family units come to be through biological necessity, just through sex, this means that in every society we know of, sex and property have some relation to each other. And then inheritance and sex have some relation to each other. And then finally, personal feelings are often the basis of coordination. And of course, sex changes how people feel about each other, sometimes quite violently so, right?
Yeah.
Both positive and negative. One way to think about it is that almost no matter what you do, if you add sex to a social environment, you're just increasing the variance of outcomes, right? Both very positive ones, great love stories, very negative ones like drama, dissolution of friend groups, destruction of community. And we've not really found a comfortable solution in the modern world to these problems.
Right.
We kind of like treat the individual symptoms, but really what we're struggling to deal with is that sex is one of these parts of life where it's very obvious that like a pure solipsistic individualism doesn't really work.
Yeah.
There are externalities to our actions. They affect other people. Yeah.
I'm kind of
So we have a hard time resolving this within, like, let's say broadly like classical liberal or liberal mindset, right? We actually have to go a little bit communitarian to regulate our social life.
I mean, I'm reminded of our conversation earlier about the social need to worship and how there were regulatory traditions to provide acceptable outlets, and over time it might have found expression in sports or theater, but they played a role seemingly in directing and perhaps redirecting this bubbling up of human energy. I mean, Freud called it libido, but he was only talking about sex. But I think Jung was probably more sophisticated. He called libido not just your sexual urges, but any human impulse that created like very explosive and sometimes uncontrollable or unexplainable behavior that is sometimes it surprised yourself. And I think with JD Unwin, I think perhaps maybe like sexual restraint leading to like more elevated levels of civilization. It could be that that was a heuristic for many different types of emotional regulators that maybe when taken in a holistic view, it produced human behavior that would lead to nice architecture, good engineering, strong families. But it's hard to pinpoint any one thing empirically.
I think we sort of all are here almost immediately probably imagine the unhappy poet
Yeah.
madly in love with the person they cannot reach and writing beautiful poetry,
Right.
or perhaps the person that to truly impress those around them, you know, becomes a leader or builds beautiful buildings or whatever.
Right.
So I think it's a very, because we all can sort of intuit that there is almost a, and I think that biologists sometimes call this displacement behavior. They don't apply to this particular situation, not particularly to sex, but biologists note that when an animal can't quite perform what its instinct says it should do, there's sometimes strange or anomalous behavior manifests, right? So perhaps it is the restraining of instinct that sometimes produces like fantastically positive displacement behavior in people if we were to apply this concept to people. I think it's very nuanced though. It's just so nuanced because, Julius Caesar was an extremely disciplined individual living in a pagan society, but I don't think he was sexually restrained. He was
Yeah.
perhaps restrained in some other ways. And it's interesting to think about that as well, right? What different types of restraint produce in individuals. Like, what are the things that crush us versus what are the things that make us stronger,
Mm-hmm.
right? And different philosophers, again, have different opinions on this.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. You wonder what was driving Julius Caesar to establish an empire when, like,
I mean, it might have even been existential terror. It's
yeah,
sort of like, I will die one day. And then he didn't have a good answer for how that could possibly end well. He perhaps didn't even think he was a good person. So maybe he did something because of that, or maybe he wanted to please the gods with the hope that it's going to work out for him.
mm-hmm.
All sorts of things. And we just don't know, right? Because we have the political image of Caesar, even though we have writing from him and about him. This was all, again, done in the public press. Can you imagine if you try to reconstruct the deep inner motives of prominent people of this era
Right.
from what you can read in the media? That's sort of where we are with Caesar.
Sure. Just not enough information.
Exactly.
So I have another theory I'd like to run by you. How are we doing on time? Are you okay to talk a little bit longer?
I could do 5 more minutes.
Okay, sure. Well, I was going to talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, but I think we should just wrap it up now. So, I mean, I guess this brings us to our current moment in Western civilization. Is America and the West more broadly in a state of decline or collapse? What do you tell someone who's not very optimistic about the future?
I would say history is very long, and that while there are collapses, there are also surprising rejuvenations of societies, refoundings.
Yeah.
If we're to be very concrete, I'm currently pessimistic and worried about, in particular, the future of Europe, also Australia. For the United States itself, though, even though it is the center of the Western world and many of the positive and negative trends, I think sort of the geographic fundamentals are just so good. You could literally lose a world war and America would still not be an occupied country. It's just sort of impossible to occupy. It's impossible to invade in a realistic sense, right? It's so dominant in its continent, right? It's not,
Yeah.
like a Germany, for example, and it's not a small island like Japan, right?
Right.
And absent external defeat, civilizations, even when they go into these bouts of self-destructive madness, they tend to recover. Sometimes it takes decades or centuries, but they tend to recover, and they often tend to try to find what will work for them. Now, does this mean the United States is going to be the world's most powerful country in perpetuity? No. It might not even be the world's most powerful country 10 years from now.
Right.
Like, we really do have to consider that possibility. Does it mean life will keep getting better? No. Actually, there are many reasons, both economic and cultural, that you might expect life to actually be worse for the next generation, at least within the developed world, right? I'm sure there are many places around the world where people's quality of life is improving still, right? So I'm not making a global statement. I'm just talking about the developed country, Western context. I think we will, within the next few decades, start talking about formerly developed countries. You know how people talk about post-communist countries and so on? I think formerly developed country is going to be a term.
Oh, wow.
Because some of these places are just suffering immense demographic crunch, rising energy prices, and a withering away of both industry, but eventually also scientific and technological accomplishment. Right. And without these advantages, right, like the Western world, if you looked at it at the zenith of its power at 1900, let's say, it was demographically dominant, it was technologically dominant, it was economically dominant. So if you take all three of those, how is that not relative decline? And especially with the inversion of the demographic pyramid and with the deindustrialization, you have also absolute decline. I think that some places will see drops in living standards just in an absolute sense, not just a relative sense. And yes, some technologies will continue to advance, like our phones will just keep, they'll be better 20 years from now, but our house might be smaller, and we might not be able to afford a car because the gas is too expensive. It's not that we can't buy a car, but the gas will just be too expensive for you to drive anywhere. And how is that not an absolute decline, even if your phone is better? I think it's naive. It's naive to claim that the technological progress that we're still seeing is sufficient to overcome some of these serious headwinds, right? But no, I said so many pessimistic things now. Let me say some more optimistic reasons for optimism. It's not just the relative geographic security. It is the fact that as institutions fail, we have seen the ability to build new institutions persist, right? There are replacement organizations and modes of being that have come into existence, right? And some of them, yes, are in the realm of technology. But I think even culturally, it feels to me we are less stuck than we were 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, as a civilization, we could not acknowledge to ourselves that we have any problems. Now we agree that we have problems, we just disagree about solutions. And that's an infinitely more productive place to be. Some people call this polarization. I actually think it's the first step to recovery and to solving these problems.
That's a great way of looking at it. And that's a good place to end. But Samo, this was a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much for your thoughts today.
Thank you for the conversation. I enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening at home, if you like this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks, guys. Take care.